Saturdays, a common day for distance runners to head out early and get a lot of mileage in to prepare for a race. As you train for longer distances, it's not always easy to map out a route. Some runners like to avoid highly populated areas because of all that stop and go. Others like to train more with laps in a controlled environment or on specified race courses. Some runners like to run in training groups, and some prefer to run solo. 33-year-old Judy liked to mix it up and do a little bit of everything, but she did prefer her solo runs a bit off the beaten path. So on this day, she picked a quiet and isolated roadway that ran parallel to the Sundance Airport, just outside Oklahoma City. This was a route that Judy had enjoyed countless times, but on this day, in the summer of 1984, it would be her last run. Judy was violently attacked, but she fought so hard to survive, clinging to life long enough to give details about who hurt her. Unfortunately, her injuries would prove to be too severe to overcome. For years, Judy's case was on the back burner because police had concluded that the man who did this was in jail for a sexual assault committed after Judy's murder. But when a huge scandal shines a spotlight on misconduct in Oklahoma City, this man becomes one of several who are proven innocent, wrongly convicted of crimes they didn't commit. And so, 40 years later, despite Judy using her dying breath to try to describe her attacker, he remains at large. We are long overdue for that to change. My name is Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved murder of Judy Weichert. It was July 28, 1984, just after 9:30 a.m., when a mother and daughter were driving down rural Sarah Road, just north of Northwest 122nd Street, on the outskirts of Northwest Oklahoma City. All of a sudden, they spotted something. I imagine it must have took them a moment to process what they were seeing, because this isn't something they were seeing, it was someone barely moving in the tall grass along the side of the road. The duo pulled over and were horrified by what they saw. There, a woman was lying there, naked and covered in blood. I cannot imagine how startling this must have been for the pair to come upon this. This was 1984 and before cell phones, so they knew they needed to get this young woman help immediately, but they also didn't want to leave her alone. So one of them stayed back with her while the other rushed off to the nearest phone to get help. This part of the story is somewhat glossed over in the articles I read, but I actually think this was incredible because the person who did this could have still been really nearby, and so for the woman who stayed back with her, that had to have been really scary. Imagine processing all of the information in front of you in that moment while also still just being scared for yourself. The young woman was barely clinging to life. She was bleeding profusely from her chest and neck and abdomen. But she tried her best to get out a few words to describe her attacker. She told the women who came upon her that she was attacked by a white man driving a blue car. EMS arrived and quickly whisked her away, working hard to stabilize her. While all this was going on, a man named Steve Weichert was growing worried. He and his wife were both marathon runners, and they had planned to do a run together on Sunday. They often ran together, but the weather had dropped to a nice cool temperature, and because it was July, Judy wanted to take advantage of that when she woke up early on that Saturday morning. So she left around 7:30 a.m. to go out for her 16-mile run. Steve was expecting her back and started to get worried. He would later say that when he woke up and got out of bed for the day after his wife left, he just felt off and like something was wrong. So this is me reminding you once again that men, just like women, can also have intuitive thoughts and feelings, gut instincts, Sophia the Holy Spirit, however you want to think of it, men can absolutely be in tune to those things too. And it seems as though Steve was on this day. He actually tried driving around to her usual jogging routes but came up empty. At the hospital, doctors tried everything to save the woman who had been brought in. They rushed her into surgery to try to repair all the damage and stop the bleeding, but she just kept losing too much blood for them to keep up with. At 1:40 p.m., she was dead. The victim was identified as 33-year-old Judy Weichert. Julie was a newlywed, and her husband Steve had been married for less than a year and purchased a home in Oklahoma City. She worked as a lease records analyst for the Eason Oil Company, and Steve owned stake in a local restaurant and was pursuing a music career. Judy was loved by so many. In an interview by KOCO5 News in 2023, her best friend Kathy Lester recalled a tearful moment just a couple of days after Judy had died. She had opened up her mailbox to find mail from Judy, and she said in the interview, quote, "I sat on the front porch and cried. How do you get a letter from someone who is already dead?" The letter had been postmarked July 27th, and Judy died on the 28th. Inside was a long handwritten note, and included in there was a recipe for her zucchini fritters, a recipe that Kathy has made many times since, thinking of her beautiful and kind friend. Judy and Steve were both avid runners, as I mentioned. Judy had only gotten into running about 5 years prior, and Steve talked about how it had changed her life. Steve said in a July 30th, 1984 interview with the Daily Oklahoman, quote, "Next to me in our home, I think running was the most important thing in her life. It gave her confidence in herself. She used to be very timid and somewhat negative-minded. Running made her a stronger, more positive person," end quote. With time, she had trained to extend her distance and eventually started entering half marathons and then marathons. She had previously done the Dallas Marathon, which is what she was training for on this day. She had recently won a 10-mile race in Edmond, Oklahoma. Judy and Steve were both members of the Oklahoma City Runners Club, where they had lots of friends. In that same 1984 article in the Oklahoman, Steve gave a little more insight into Judy's running. As I said before, they did enjoy training together, but she also loved her solo runs. He said, quote, "The short runs she would do in the residential areas, but they didn't mean as much to her. She loved running on the country roads. They were very peaceful, but apparently very dangerous," end quote. And that was messaging that the Oklahoma City Police Department and citizens were quick to jump on. Within just a few days of her death, there were articles published in various newspapers about the dangers of jogging alone. Some even going as far as to say it's not enough to have two women jogging alone together, rather. A man must be present. There were jogger safety seminars hosted and self-defense courses. But if you're listening to this, you probably are already aware this hasn't done much to help with the problem. Millions of people go out for runs and walks every single day. The vast majority go perfectly fine, and yet still, jogger attacks are something we have always contended with and continue to. And when they happen, it's really bad. But let's even back it up further, because statistically, most female joggers will not be sexually assaulted or murdered. But you want to know what so many regular female joggers will tell you they do encounter? Harassment. This year, there was a study conducted at the University of Manchester by Dr. Caroline Miles and Professor Rose Broad. They surveyed female joggers and found that 68% reported they had experienced some form of abusive behavior. 58% reported that they had experienced some verbal abuse or verbal harassment. 19% of women said they had been followed, 7% said they had been flashed at, and 13% described other forms of harassment and abuse, such as having things thrown at them while running. And of course, a subset group of the study reported being physically attacked while running. 7 of the total respondents had been sexually assaulted. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, at least to me, 95% of survey respondents said that they did not go to the police. Some of the reasons being that the abuse of women in public is just so normalized that these incidents may seem trivial and just part of normal life as a woman. Women were worried police wouldn't take them seriously or even be able to identify that a crime had truly taken place. 82% of those surveyed said they felt some form of safety concerns while running, and many took things with them like personal alarms, running with their dogs, keys in between their fingers, smartwatches, etc. Judy was someone who took these precautions. Steve stated that Judy was extremely cautious. So, for example, if she saw a car pull over towards the side of the road or parked on the side of the road, she wouldn't jog past it. She would turn around and go the other way. But piggybacking off of everything I was just saying about the harassment, Steve said she had experienced harassment on her solo runs before. Catcalling, being followed, and being made to feel uncomfortable, and ultimately he thinks this may have had the opposite effect that you think it might. So even though in real time it was scary for her, each time nothing happened of true physical harm to her, she would think that it was unlikely that it would. He said, quote, "When you run, your mind has a tendency to leave your body. You become sort of detached, and I think that is how someone could have come up on her. Since nothing had happened back then, she had just become braver and braver as time went on," end quote. Steve did have 2 notable observations about Judy's run that day. Number 1, for starters, the route she took was one that she had done before, but she hadn't done in a really long time. So he isn't sure why she picked it on that day. Not only that, the area she was found was off of the path of that normal route if she was going to do that one. 2, her can of mace was missing. She always brought mace on her longer runs, and it wasn't found on her or near her or back at the house. So TBD as to where that went. Police searching the area of the attack looked for clues, and piecing together the evidence at the scene as well as the autopsy, they were able to determine that Judy had been sexually assaulted and stabbed almost 24 times, and then left in a field to die. Given her route and what time she had left, police felt she was about an hour into her run when the attack occurred. After her assailant left her to die, she crawled 50 feet towards the roadway and underneath a barbed wire fence to get to the side of the road and try to flag down help. But she was so gravely injured that by the time she got to the side of the road, she couldn't move in a way that would get her noticed. So for an hour, she bled out as cars continued driving past her, not noticing her. That was until the mother-daughter pair arrived, but by that point, it was far too late. There was forensic evidence left at the scene by the attacker as well because of the sexual assault. Back in 1984, there wasn't as much to be done with DNA as there is now, but it was revealed that the attacker had an extremely rare blood type, found in less than 1% of white males. They also recovered blonde hairs from her body, which didn't match her or Steve as they both had dark coloring. Within a few days, investigators released a sketch to the public. According to Lieutenant Dave McBride at the time, they were looking for a white male in their late 20s to early 30s with dirty, long blonde hair, a beard, a ruddy complexion, muscular arms with a circular tattoo on their left shoulder. This person possibly drove a faded blue Volkswagen Beetle. I've mentioned before how in these very old cold cases, reporting blurs together and it can be kind of hard to get the facts straight. I've encountered it a ton with this case, even things like the time of the attack and when she was found being all over the place. So I've stuck with what is most consistently reported in the most reliable of sources. But this suspect piece is another example where information gets a little conflated. Some articles will say that this is the description that Judy herself gave, but that isn't the case. Because based on the seriousness of Judy's injuries and from early reports, my understanding is she could barely get out the words, white guy, blue car. She wouldn't have been able to have any ability to capture appearances, nuances to an appearance, or a make and model of a car. Instead, the suspect and car description came from neighborhood canvassing where people had reported a suspicious man and vehicle driving around who was unfamiliar to the neighborhood. What exactly the suspicious behavior was, I couldn't find. In early August, Judy's running club put up a $10,000 reward for information, and before long, the police put up $5,000, bringing the total reward up to $15,000. Later in August, there was an uptick of reports of men exposing themselves to female joggers. In mid-August, a woman was jogging in another northwest Oklahoma City area near North Mueller Ave and Northwest 58th Street. This area is about 7 miles away from Judy's attack. As she was jogging, she saw a man pull to the side of the road in front of her about 2 houses ahead of her. There, he opened the door and exposed his nude body to her. Coming up upon this, she stopped before getting to him and ran to the first nearby house. She was frightened as the homeowners didn't answer the door right away, and she had to ring the doorbell several times. When they finally did, she ran inside and phoned police. She remembered the license plate number because she noticed the car had passed her a few times earlier driving slowly, so she had taken note of it, just in case. A 47-year-old man named Weichert was arrested in that incident, and police were quick to say that they didn't believe it was connected to Judy's case. He was older than the suspect, and this was a fair distance away, a different time of day, etc. I can't say for certain what they did or did not do to rule him out, though. Investigators told news sources at that time that they were working on 3 of those types of flasher cases from the past couple of weeks, and that they had 2 suspects in 2 of the cases, Weichert being one of them. Lieutenant Dave McBride was pretty low-key about them, though. He said it was nothing new to have people expose themselves to joggers, and that he thinks that there was just a larger drive to report it after Judy's murder, but that there hadn't actually been more, nor did he think they were related. He just thought, okay, well, now they're actually getting reported because people are fearful because another jogger was murdered. Which, I'm not going to lie, that was kind of wild to me to read. I jog a lot and I have had some weird encounters with people, but I've never had anybody flash me. McBride also shared that, again, the most practical advice is to just not jog alone. But here I am, Megan the podcaster, and I'm going to share even more practical advice. Just don't expose your genitals to passing joggers, okay? Keep your clothes on inside your vehicle. Don't be an absolute creep and predator. I think that's way better advice, but I digress. At the 1-year mark of Judy's murder, the investigation had lost its spark. Judy's name was no longer mentioned on the news, and the public had all but stopped talking about the case. The robust task force had been disbanded with only 2 investigators still actively working on it. Paul Schell from the Daily Oklahoman ran an anniversary piece in the paper and interviewed both investigators and Steve. Steve struggled immensely after Judy's death. He sold off his portion of the ownership in the restaurant, and he took a hiatus from making music. He said, quote, "Music has always been an outlet for what I was feeling, but I guess this has all been too hard," end quote. His life was just frozen in time. He got back into running 6 days a week, but said he didn't even do close to the number of miles he used to do when he could run alongside his beautiful wife, Judy. As for investigators, they were running into a wall. They had asked the FBI to create a criminal profile for the perpetrator, but when they went to the FBI, they were actually looking into similar cases beginning in the fall of 1983. There were 3 cases quite similar to Judy's that the FBI was involved in. One in Pomona, California, one in Las Vegas, Nevada, and one in Fairfax County, Virginia. All of those incidents involved women jogging in remote locations, being attacked during their run, sexually assaulted, and then they were stabbed. The victims in the Pomona and Las Vegas cases had died, but the Fairfax County victim had survived. She described her perpetrator as having dark hair, and the forensic evidence matched that. This caused the FBI to heavily debate if these cases were connected at all, and as they worked to get information on the cases and try to find connections to build and form a profile, it actually had the impact that it delayed the profile being formed in Judy's case, so it actually kind of threw a wrench into things. Personally, I'm not in law enforcement, and I'm not going to pretend I have more info than those working out of Quantico, but it's far-fetched to me that a serial rapist is in all of these different states committing the same crime. As I already mentioned, joggers, female joggers in particular, have always had to contend with the risk of violence. I would suspect that Pomona, Vegas, Fairfax County, and Oklahoma City are 4 different rapists who stab their victims. But that's just my opinion. The next break in the case would happen in the spring of 1986, when authorities announced they had a suspect in Judy's murder. To arrive at how they identified a suspect in 1986, we first have to back up to May 8th of 1985. A woman who lived in the Wood Lake apartment complex in Oklahoma City returned home on her lunch break. In doing so, she surprised a burglar. Rather than flee, this burglar attacked her and stabbed her in the arm with a meat fork. He then brutally sexually assaulted her and threatened to kill her. This victim ultimately did survive her terrifying ordeal and called police. Police set out looking for people who lived and worked in the area and fit the description of the attacker. They also wanted to examine if this rape could be connected to others, namely Judy Weichert. Both Judy and this rape victim had been sexually assaulted and had been penetrated both vaginally and sodomized. And there were blonde hairs at both scenes. In both instances, the women were stabbed, though there was quite a difference in weapon and the actual act itself. Judy was stabbed nearly 24 times in her neck, chest, and abdomen. This victim was stabbed in the arm, which is still terrible, just different. The perpetrator had repeatedly told the victim that he would kill her if she looked at him, so she didn't have an ongoing ability to study him and get a great look. Finding those who had been around that day, police set their eyes on a man named Jeffrey Todd Pierce. Pierce had been on a landscaping crew working in the complex that day. He didn't really fit the description the survivor had given, and when they first presented him to her, she did not identify him as her attacker. But this didn't stop investigators from pursuing him. In the early spring of 1996, they brought Pierce back in to a photo lineup. This time, they put him in a tan shirt, which was the color the rape victim said her attacker had worn that day. And now, this time, the victim identified Pierce as her attacker in that photo lineup. This gave police the ability to get a warrant to search his belongings and obtain other physical DNA and evidence from him, which, by the way, they did not need. He waived objections to search his body. He insisted and freely provided head hair, pubic hair, saliva, blood, any DNA sample they asked for because he wanted to clear his name. But it had the opposite effect. 5 minutes later, yes, 5 minutes, they returned and they told him that the hairs matched hair found at the scene of the rape. And wouldn't you know, Pierce had a rare blood type that less than 1% of the population has. Investigators kept digging in deeper, and they found a weapon in Pierce's home that looked like it could have created the wounds on Judy Weichert as well, so they started to draw their own conclusions. Pierce was arrested and charged with just the rape, but police openly discussed to the media that they felt he was a strong suspect in Judy Weichert's case. He went to trial maintaining his innocence, something his defense tried to present through his alibi that day. During the lunch hour the attack occurred, Pierce had gone to lunch with his coworkers. It was also his wife's birthday that day, so he had spent the rest of the time from lunch making a purchase to give her that night: diamond earrings. But that didn't seem to carry the same weight as the forensic evidence from the prosecution, which relied heavily on the expertise of forensic chemist Joyce Gilchrist. Joyce Gilchrist's forensic analysis identified a total of 33 scalp and pubic hair samples from the crime scene as, quote, microscopically consistent with evidence taken from Mr. Pierce's body. She thus concluded that the hairs could have come from Jeffrey Todd Pierce. The prosecution was also allowed to freely discuss how he was a prime suspect in the Judy Weichert homicide. This information and Gilchrist's persuasive testimony was enough to convince the jury. Pierce was found guilty and sentenced to 65 years, the longest allowable punishment for the crime. Pierce was in his early 20s at the time, so this was effectively a life sentence. He would be close to 90 years old by the time the sentence was served. Jeffrey Todd Pierce also had newborn twin babies at home. Pierce maintained that he was innocent and had been misidentified in the lineup. He was mandated to sex offender treatment in prison, which he refused, and that resulted in lost prison privileges. And those early days of thinking that it was all just a bad dream and that the mistake would be realized soon, well, they turned into weeks and months and years. All the while, nobody was continuing to investigate Judy Weichert's murder. Even though Jeffrey Todd Pierce had not been charged with the crime, police viewed this as a technicality, and they were confident that the man who did this was behind bars. So her story dropped out of the media, and for well over a decade, nothing happened. That was until 2001, when a bombshell would make everyone question what they knew about the Judy Weichert case and what they knew about the justice system in Oklahoma City. So this next part is temporarily going to deviate from Judy's case specifically and go into the scandal within Oklahoma City in law enforcement and in the prosecutor's office. But I promise, hang in there because it does all tie together and impact Judy's case in a major way, still feeling the ripple effects even today. You'll remember Joyce Gilchrist, the expert forensic chemist who attested to the hairs at the rape scene matching the hairs of Jeffrey Todd Pierce. Well, Joyce had earned quite a reputation. She had an apparent eye for forensic analysis. She would see things that other scientists couldn't evidently see and testify to things they wouldn't. It had earned her the moniker Black Magic. She told 60 Minutes in an interview that it came from one particular case. She said, quote, "It was in reference to a homicide case where the defense attorney referred to me in his closing statements as a sorcerer, someone who conducted black magic, and stated that I seemed to be able to do things with evidence that nobody else was able to do." End quote. Beyond her ability to just analyze evidence, she was extremely persuasive in court, and this was a huge tool for the prosecution. But in 2001, Gilchrist became the subject of an FBI investigation when some of her expertise was put under a microscope and cases she had influence in were reviewed. I'll share more of the greater impact in a minute, but let's first talk Jeffrey Todd Pierce. A review of his case found that Gilchrist had concealed the fact that Mr. Pierce's hair did not match the hairs found at the crime scene. 2, she violated the district court order to deliver the hair samples in a timely manner for review by Mr. Pierce's forensic expert. And 3, she disregarded her own findings that Mr. Pierce's blood contained a particular enzyme, PGM21, which conclusively precluded Mr. Pierce from being the source of the sperm found on the victim. That's right. Gilchrist had this knowledge but chose to falsify this evidence to help with the prosecution of Pierce. Further DNA testing proved that Jeffrey Todd Pierce unequivocally could not have been the source of the DNA in both the 1985 rape case nor Judy Weichert's. In fact, Judy's case and the 1985 case were now ruled out as committed by the same person altogether. At this point, he had served 15 years of his sentence when he was finally freed. His twin boys were teenagers now, and he had missed out on their whole childhood. Pierce maintained his innocence the entire time he was in prison. He had the opportunity to come up for parole a year prior to his release based on the new evidence, but one of the qualifications was he had to admit his guilt, and he refused. He would rather stay in jail than get out based on a lie. Pierce did go on to sue Gilchrist and the city for $4 million total. Well, he actually asked for a lot more, but they settled on $4 million, and in my opinion, that was not even close to enough. But we're not done being filled with rage for Joyce Gilchrist. When the DNA from the rape in 1985 was put back into the system, they actually identified the source of the semen. He was another rapist who was sitting in jail already for another rape case. But get this, because Pierce had been sitting in jail for 15 years, and the statute of limitations on rape cases in Oklahoma is 7 years, he couldn't be tried for it, and he still can't ever again. So he actually got out early from his own sentence for the rape he was convicted of, and he got out 1 year after Pierce. And he now lives as a registered sex offender in Lansing, Michigan. So if you're keeping track, Judy's case was not looked into for 15 years, and her killer remained free and not even pursued during that time. An innocent man sat in prison, and the person who committed a rape case got out shortly after that man and is now a free man himself, never tried for the rape he committed. But just so you have a sense of the horrific consequences of Joyce Gilchrist, here is a bit more information. The probe found she had repeatedly testified on things outside of her scope. She had falsified evidence, lost evidence, and was part of over 3,000 criminal cases in her 21-year career. Her evidence review and expert testimony led in part to 23 people sentenced to death, 12 of whom have been executed. Just a few examples of other cases she has botched. A man named Michael Blair was sentenced to die for the murder of a young girl in 1993. The evidence leading to his conviction included shafts of hair found near the girl's body and Blair's car. New DNA evidence showed that hair matched neither the girl or Blair. Another one, when an appeal was in the works for a man named Malcolm Rent Johnson, who was also a death penalty case, 2 forensic experts hired by the defense reviewed Gilchrist's testimony, and they found that the blue-colored hairs and fibers she found were too ubiquitous to be useful as evidence. A man named Curtis McCarty was released in 2007 after spending nearly 20 years on death row. The courts found that Gilchrist acted to either alter or intentionally lose evidence. He did try to sue Gilchrist for her wrongdoing, but this case was thrown out on technical terms, which is also the experience of many exonerees if you read about it. In June of 2018, Johnny Edward Tallbear was released after 26 years in jail for a murder he did not commit. Gilchrist testified under oath that Tallbear's blood matched that found at the scene of the crime, but DNA testing showed this to be incorrect. This is not an exhaustive list, and the impacts of this are still being felt today. This scandal was in the news a bit at the time. You may have heard of it, but personally, I don't think we as a society were loud enough about it. That woman should have gone to jail. Instead, she was fired and went on to just kind of start a new life and started a candle making business. She died in 2015 at the age of 67. Since the release of Pierce and the clearing of his name, the police tasked with investigating Judy's case had an uphill battle. Literally almost nothing was done in the case for all of those years. The DNA evidence from the case was entered into CODIS, but there were no hits. So then, the next steps now would be to try some of the new DNA techniques out there, like genetic genealogy or working with Othram Labs. It is cost prohibitive, but there are options out there. If the Oklahoma City Police Department does not have this in their budget, they can apply for support from nonprofits that help, such as Season of Justice, which helps fund DNA testing in cold cases. So that's where you come in as a listener. Please share Judy's case and advocate and put on the pressure for this additional DNA testing. There is a woman named Amanda Newland Davis who is a criminologist who runs a website called Oklahoma Cold Cases. She has been advocating for Judy's case for years alongside tons of other unsolved cases. Go check out her website, oklahomacoldcases.org, and amplify the work they are doing and see how we can continue to advocate for the testing of DNA evidence in Judy's case. There is also a Facebook page about Judy Weichert's murder, though I haven't seen it active since 2020, so I'm not sure if there are currently still updates, but you can go follow it because there is a ton of useful information on there. Judy's parents both died not knowing what happened to their daughter. Her husband, Steve, carried grief throughout his life, but did eventually find love again and create beautiful music again. He sadly died a little over 10 years ago of cancer, also without answers. Judy used every last bit of energy she had left and her very last words on this earth to try to get her killer caught. The least we can do is keep talking for her and keep her message going until he is. If you have any information on the 1984 murder of Judy Weichert, please contact the Oklahoma City Police Department Crime Stoppers at 405-235-7300. That's 405-235-7300. Or report online at okccrimetips.com. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. I always appreciate case discussions, so you can comment on the podcast or on our social media channels on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. Each week, I upload supporting pictures to our Instagram at simplertimecrimepod. For case suggestions, please reach out to simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. Join me next Monday as I dive into another older unsolved case. And once again, thank you so much for listening.